community, but specifically as it relates to African Americans who are encountering Islam. So to begin, there is a text, there is a scripture, a verse in the Quran in chapter 2, verse 183, that introduces the idea of spiritual cultivation through fasting. And it goes like this: O people of faith, O people of faith, fasting is prescribed for you, meaning it's now a duty, an obligation, as it was prescribed on those before you. It was also something that religious communities before you engaged in some way, in some manner, so that you may become more mindful of God. So that's the introduction. That's the verse itself, verse 183. So first thing is that fasting is introduced to the community. And historically speaking, the prayer was introduced first. And then came fasting. And in this injunction, we are told that this is something that is, fasting is something that's not unique to one community. It is something that is consistent in the religious context. It's some form of abstinence, some form of withholding, some form of limitations, some form of altering of the diet is part and parcel of what it means to cultivate a sense of spiritual well-being. And that is something that is inherited, passed down, transmitted from one religious community to another. But why? And the text tells us, so that you may become more mindful, more conscious of the divine. Because so often we tend to be very mindful and conscious of ourselves. And that tends to preoccupy us even away from being conscious of others around us sometimes, let alone of the divine being who is, while not being physically obvious, nonetheless present. And so we, in the Quranic sense, in the Islamic sense, we're told that the purpose of the core purpose of fasting is to cultivate a better sense of mindfulness, awareness. This is consistent with the practice of meditation as well. And so the verses go on and talks about, fasting is for a limited number of days, so that's to protect people from thinking they have to fast for the rest of their lives, for example, and that it's done in the month of Ramadan. And then there are other verses that say if you're traveling or if you're ill, you don't have to fast, but you should make the days up. So the text introduces spiritual cultivation through fasting. Fasting in general terms, widely understood, is for the purpose of, or at least the way it's broadly understood in the, particularly for purposes of Ramadan, in the Muslim community, it's understood that the deep meaning of this is to allow the human being a chance to liberate themselves from being strictly consumers. Because if all you do is consume and consume and consume and consume, and all you do is think about just yourself, then you tend to become consumed by your own consumption. And then you become, if you're not careful, that can lead to predatory and dangerous behavior. And so the idea of fasting is to teach one self-restraint. Not only self-restraint, but also thankfulness, and to be grateful, gratitude for everything that we have. And so Ramadan, fasting, is a time not only where you rein in your habits of consumption, but also where you think about giving to others even though you're in need. Where you think about what it means to become molded by your own human desires, but yet not to be driven by them, by those same drives. But you learn to control them, feel them, manage them, patiently endure. There was a national statistic that was done some years ago where they surveyed, the federal government had done some research into inmates and prisoners in the United States that were locked up in the federal prison system. And they found that around 76% of inmates in the federal prison system in the United States had one common historical theme when they interviewed their backgrounds, etc. The one commonality they had was that they would never learned the skill or the talent or the human capacity of delayed gratification. They just were taught to act on their desires. So fasting helps to cultivate that sense that we should be more than just subjects of our wants. We are meant to transcend that, to go above that. And that mindfulness of being more than that and doing more than that and striving for more than that, rising above that, is rooted in mindfulness of the divine. So I thought I would introduce that as the overarching common theme of what is sort of understood and behind this moment, this Ramadan moment. Now, for American Muslims, and specifically for African American Muslim converts to Islam, Ramadan, in addition, and fasting, in addition to what I just mentioned, takes on another layered meaning, actually a few more layers of meanings. One of the core things that distinguishes or that hit when Islam came to this country, one of the first areas that it came to were the urban inner city areas, Chicago, Philadelphia, New York, Detroit. And over time, and when I say over time, I'm going to fast forward to the 60s now, there was a big challenge. And the challenge was that, with the civil rights movement going on in this country, and also you had an introduction of a different faith tradition. And the faith tradition looked different depending on who was coming from different places. So Islam from Turkish Muslims looked one way, even though there was the same prayer, fasting, and all of these things, but the presentation, the culture was different. The way it looked from India provided a different presentation. The way it looked from Arabia provided a different connotation, a different presentation. From Sudan or Nigeria is very different in terms of the culture. So when it hit urban, inner city, black communities, the question was, what do we do with it? And what are we going to do with the ideas that are here? Sure, prayer was brand new, coming out of the Nation of Islam. Everybody sort of left that. After the nation, the question was, well, how do we formulate that? What do we do with this? We're not going to go with the issue of race. We're going to go with a religious tradition here, a faith tradition. But what's it going to look like? What are we going to do with it? So one of the core aspects of Islam that resonated very strongly with particularly African American Muslims was the idea of Ramadan and fasting. the notion that of self-control, self-discipline, and more importantly, the idea of freedom. That through fasting, the human being, the human spirit, dare I say, was liberated. And it didn't matter if the body was subjugated or incarcerated, or if the body was subject to brutality through abuses in the street. Most of us know the history of the civil rights struggle in this country. The body was the object of many abuses. And so just because the body was abused did not mean that the spirit needed also to be abused. So while the prayer was important in Islam, and the prayer is a bodily thing. Most Americans have seen Muslims pray. It's very physical. The body's in motion. Right? There are moments of stability, but there are moments of instability and motion as well. The fast is different because you can't see a person fast. You can't tell if a person's fasting. So the person is engaged, the fasting person is engaged in an act of liberation and, dare I say, protest. I mean, you think about like people that are incarcerated that go on protest fasts, right? They just don't eat, and it's a form of protest, for example, right? Similar concept. So it's a form of liberation. The idea that I am not going to be driven by not only my desire, let alone your desire. My late father, when he was 16 in Atlanta, Georgia, he used to study the Bible with Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. So one day he was late to class. And when he came in, he was telling me he'd gotten into a fight. And after class, Dr. King pulled him aside and he asked him, what happened. He saw he was a little bit disheveled and etc. And he said, "Why are you late? What happened?" Not in a negative way, but it was really inquiring. He said, "What happened? What happened? Are you okay? And what made you late?" He said, "Well, I got into a fight." So what happened? "Well, this person on the street said this to me and tried to stop me and provoked me and called me this. And then I responded. Then that person responded back. And he pushed me and I pushed him back. You know how this goes." And Dr. King told my father, he said, "My son," he said, "so long as you are bound to other people's egos, you will always be a slave." In other words, so long as you react to somebody else's ego, to somebody else's desire, you will never be a free person. You'll always be a slave of that person's desires. One thing to be a slave of your own desire. Right? That alone is not liberating in the spiritual sense. Spiritual cultivation, at least in the Islamic tradition, is about, and I would venture to say in all religious traditions, is about a sense of transcendence above the self, but not leaving the self, but coming out of the self to help mold the self, but never abandoning yourself. So he said, you'll always be a slave, meaning you'll always be shackled down and restricted and limited in your capacity to grow and to develop. You'll never thrive like that. So it's a very similar concept, actually. So that fasting, in this sense, was received by the African-American Muslim community, to serve as a means for spiritual liberation at a time when the body was not yet fully liberated. And because of this, social justice and a concern for the poor, and a concern for the downtrodden, a concern for forgotten members of society, became a core element of Islamic culture, if you will, in American Muslim communities, and specifically African American Muslim communities. That the way it was shaped became formed and fashioned through that channel. Fasting became the lens through which African Americans would see Islam as a whole. And from that, different convert communities, so Latino American Muslims, for example, would view Islam through that lens as well. This is the first aspect, which distinguishes the perspective of Islam, and therefore the practice of Islam in the United States, from other parts of the Muslim world. That at its core, it is extremely social justice oriented and targeted towards specifically the poor and the downtrodden. Now, the other part of where this is quite interesting is the references, goes back to the last part of the verse, so that you can be mindful of God. You know, fasting is prescribed for you as it was prescribed to those before you, so that you can be mindful of the divine. This idea of mindfulness. The idea of mindfulness is very, very important, and became very important in the way Islam was reinterpreted, shall I say, and understood in the Black American community, convert community, specifically after the death of Malcolm X, after the transition of Black Americans from the Nation of Islam. The idea of mindfulness. You got to be mindful. You have to cultivate a different state of the mind. And this came from the idea that for a long time in American history, Black Americans, African Americans, either did not have a chance to cultivate the mind, or they had a lesser chance to cultivate the mind. Or when they had a chance, there were various forms of indoctrination. So somebody else's mind was imposed on them. So they were, groups that were brought up in certain ideologies, like the Nation of Islam, for example, and like other groups where an entire community was at the whims of one person who imposed their way of thinking or their ideology on the entire community. And so, while following a particular leader in the Black American experience had positive repercussions in terms of certain communal benefits, it also restricted the thinking ability as well, because all the thinking had to be done one way. So in the post-civil rights movement, when there was a mass influx of conversions to Islam in the African American community after Malcolm X, Black Americans who converted to Islam, looking at this verse, were forced to think about thought. They were forced to think about thinking. What does it mean to be mindful when your mind is already full of somebody else's mind? How can the mind be full of the divine when it's full of the material and somebody else's material, somebody else's baggage? Right? The idea that religious experience, material experience, political experience, social experience would be framed by the ideas of just one person and imposed on a broad community. Is that healthy or no? So this caused a reaction in the African American convert community post-1965. And the result was a really strong, I don't want to say fear, but an aversion to any kind of imposed ideology, even if it meant the imposition of a cultural practice. Any kind of way of thinking that was imposed began to be automatically thought about, critiqued, assessed, before it was absorbed. And therefore, in those terms, there was a thinking that you have to be very aware and astute about the difference between culture and religion. And specifically, that is a phenomenon of American Islam in general nowadays, that they're particularly in the college and the universities with American Muslims and in American Muslim communities, that there is this overarching question when anything is encountered: is this culture or is this religion? Is this ideology or is this really in the faith tradition? Is this Islam or Hislam? Right? This sort of assessment about what exactly are we dealing with here. And it came from a history of controlled thought in the African American experience, which caused this reaction. So in order to be mindful of God, fasting involves, for example, restraint in the appetites, restricting and limiting the diet and the appetites in order to cleanse the self, so that it weans itself off of becoming full of the material. And it learns to satiate itself from being full of the spiritual. Because arguably you cannot put material and spiritual focus in the same space. Oftentimes you have to release things that are waste before anything of value can. Look at this beautiful space. I would argue in this beautiful spiritual space, there is nothing that is of no use. Everything has a purpose. And not only a purpose in this space, but it is arranged beautifully. That's order, not in the political sense, that's order in the spiritual sense. And if there is something here that doesn't belong, shouldn't belong, doesn't have a purpose, it's got to be removed. Or even if it's not physically removed, it's got to be removed from its one place and put in a proper place. That's what fasting is. So one tends to remove oneself from the appetite of just indulging. So if you're going to do that with food and drink, for example, why would you not do that with thought as well? Why shouldn't you fast from thoughts that are not only oppressive, but not productive? Further than that, thoughts that are, or impositions of other thoughts that are intrusive, that are destructive to your spiritual well-being. What good is it to, there's a tradition in the Islamic religion where the Prophet Muhammad said, if you spend your days backbiting and gossiping other people, well, what good is it to abstain from food and drink? So why would you, cultivate, say, well, I'm not going to drink and I'm not going to eat on the one hand, but then you spend your time, filling other people's spirits with mess, right? So fasting became, in the African American Muslim community, became something that wasn't just about staying away from diet, a certain diet, in general, but it was also about fasting from other kinds of impositions which impose themselves and break the spiritual human condition as well. And in order to do that, there had to be a rethinking about what religion was and what was a presentation of religion in the guise of ideology, or in the guise of cultural norms, or in the guise or some other guise. And that became something very different in the way Islam was received and then presented and understood and practiced in the American context versus what you would get in other countries overseas, for example. So now, where does that leave us? So while globally Muslims will begin to partake in Ramadan, and the fasting begins tomorrow officially. So starting tomorrow, you'll find Muslims, it would not be uncommon to encounter a Muslim who would not be eating and drinking, for example, until the sun sets. Because that's the way the participation of Ramadan goes. That's spiritual cultivation and practice in one way. But in the African American context, that's just the beginning. That's only the beginning. That's the foundation. What you think about matters. Should you be listening to talk radio? Other media outlets where filth and muddy things are being discussed? No. Fasting, in this sense, would mean avoiding those things as well. For what good is it for you to be hungry and thirsty, but then you're listening to things that are polluting your mind? That's an obstacle to mindfulness of the divine. Or should you just be thinking about what you can eat for dinner when dinner time comes? Well, that's a normal human behavior. When you're hungry, you think about food. When you're thirsty, you think about quenching your thirst. But specifically in the African American Muslim context, that's not what we're taught to think about. When you're hungry, you think about all the other people that are hungry. What good is it for you to feed yourself if others around you are not fed? And that's not just people in a room. That's people globally. So the more you're hungry, the more you have to think about the global hunger of others. It's not something like pie in the sky stuff. You're bound to do that. Because you cannot be, in this sense, the way Islam is received in this particular context, you cannot be a religious person and only concerned about your well-being. Neither the well-being of just those that are like you. Neither the well-being of only those that practice the way you practice. You have to be concerned about the well-being of everybody. Everybody. And so mindfulness of God means mindfulness of all of God's children as well. All of God's creation as well. So if I hunger, then how does my hunger, what does that tell me about the kind of human experience that comes from that desire? If I hunger for something, there are others that hunger as well. And not everybody hungers for food. Some people hunger for shelter. Some people hunger for rights. Some people hunger for company, for consolement, for relief from opioid addictions. There are different forms of hunger and thirst. So the idea of liberation, and dare I say a liberation theology, comes out of this as well. Goes back to the ultimate idea of freedom, social justice. So breaking the fast at night is not successful if you're doing it alone, and is not successful if you're just getting full. And neither is it successful if you're just breaking fast with people around you that look like you and talk like you and pray with you or pray like you. How have you broken the fast of someone who's incarcerated? How have you broken the fast of someone who's in need of housing? Because they're still fasting, their fast is just different. So that is what Ramadan means for African American convert Muslims who've received fasting in the way that everyone else around all the other Muslims around the world have received it, but understood it very differently. And try to practice it differently because of the context of the American condition and the history of the Black American community here. And it is marked by a clear distinction between culture and religion and ideology and religion, and a pursuit of thinking about thought. And so in that sense, the community does experience clash with other Muslim communities as well. Everything's not unified as though we'd like to see. There are differences, because there are differences in understanding and application. But that is part of the human struggle. To be spiritual is, in the words of Rumi, and I'll close, I think, with this poetic verse from Rumi, which I think is very appropriate. The human condition is like he said, if I may share two brief aphorisms from Rumi. The first is, I'm amazed at the person that wants to be a diamond. How can they complain about the scrubbing or about the polishing, right? So, you want to be spiritual, well, it's not a smooth path. There's some friction. You want to be a diamond, but don't complain about the polishing. And the other, if I may end with this, he said, the meaning of which, he didn't speak in English, the meaning of which, the rug, these beautiful carpets, he said the rug or the carpet is not beaten because it did something bad. On the contrary, to cleanse it. If you take in the old days, I used to live overseas, so, my wife's Egyptian American, so in Egypt they hang the carpet out the window and they beat the carpet. In Turkey they do the same thing. In Yemen, when I lived in Yemen, a decade ago, they did the same thing, put the carpet out and they beat the carpet, The dust, you can see the dust if you're walking under an apartment window, good luck. They beat the dust, and so he says the carpet is not beaten because it's done something bad, but because that's what's required to remove the filth. So struggle is a part of spiritual cultivation. That sense of struggle in the social justice sense becomes core element and core thinking in the American Muslim, specifically the African American Muslim community. I just wanted to share that with you. I want to thank you for your attention, for your time. May all of you be blessed, and may all of you be beautiful examples of spiritually cultivated human beings. Thank you. Thank you, Swami.
Kapil. Thank you so very much for sharing with us. It's the insights and thoughts. There is a lot to chew on and lot to reflect in the days ahead. So thank you once again for doing that. Upcoming programs for the week. We'll have the Upanishad class as usual on Wednesday evening. The Tuesday and Saturday meditations in the evening will also continue as usual. And next Sunday, we'll have Antar Yoga. As we do every month, there'll be readings and it's a Mother's Day. So we'll have readings by members, and then we will also celebrate the birthdays of everyone born in the month of May. So all of you are welcome next Sunday as well. Let's conclude with a prayer on page 3. May the Divine Being, who is the Father in heaven of the Christians, Holy One of the Jewish faith, Allah of the Muslims, Buddha of the Buddhists, Tao of the Taoists, Ahura Mazda of the Zoroastrians, the Great Spirit of the Native Americans, and Brahman of the Hindus, lead us from the unreal to the real, from darkness to light, from death to immortality. May we be granted strength, freedom, and clear understanding. May we learn to see God in our own hearts and in everyone around us. May God bless us all and fill our hearts with gratitude, grace, and love. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. Peace, peace, peace be unto all.